Welcome to LinesToGo installation videos. Today we will be removing and installing stainless steel brake lines on a 2006 Toyota Rav4 using LinesToGo part number BLT-110-SS. While this particular installation is being performed on a 2006 Toyota Rav4, this set of lines will also fit the following year, make, and models as shown on your screen now. LinesToGo lines are made using original equipment end forms and fittings that are CNC bent for an easy and precise installation. We have also upgraded to stainless steel braided Teflon hoses for rust protection and to prevent surface fouling. These have an unlimited shelf life and anti-static PTFE liner. This set of LinesToGo lines are made using 304L stainless steel for rust resistance that exceeds OEM standards. Tech tip: disconnect the battery before working on a vehicle to reduce the risk of shorting out the battery on tools or lines. LinesToGo lines are made with a sectional design for easier installation. We also use color-coded unions on our sectioned lines. Just match the colors at the connections. Make sure to depressurize the fuel system before starting the installation. Tools required: 10mm, 14mm, 19mm, and 21mm sockets and ratchet, 10mm and 13mm wrenches, flat blade screwdriver, pliers and cutting pliers, drain pan, jack and jack stands. The level of difficulty for this installation is considered to be medium. Start by disconnecting the negative battery terminal using a 10mm wrench. Use a flat blade screwdriver to remove the plastic clips that secure the wiring harness to the air filter housing. Disconnect the mass airflow and purge valve electrical connectors. Use a 10mm socket to loosen the clamp that secures the intake air tube to the air filter housing and disconnect the tube from the housing. Open the two clips that secure the air filter housing closed and remove the air filter housing lid and filter from the vehicle. Use a 10mm socket to remove the 3 bolts that secure the lower air filter housing and remove it from the vehicle. Remove the PCV tube from the intake air tube. Next, remove the rubber hose from the fuel vapor tube. Next, at the rear of the engine, remove the final rubber hose from the connection at the engine. Use a 10mm socket or wrench to loosen the clamp and remove the intake air tube from the vehicle. Use a 10mm wrench to remove both threaded fittings from the master cylinder. Next, use a 10mm wrench to remove the 6 threaded fittings from the ABS module. Remove the primary and secondary brake lines from the plastic clips and remove them from the vehicle. Remove the remaining brake lines from the plastic clips. Next, raise and support the vehicle and remove all 4 wheels using a 21mm socket. Inside of the left front wheel well, remove the threaded fitting from the left front flex hose using a 10mm wrench. Use a 10mm socket to remove the bolt that secures the brake line. Remove the right front brake line from the vehicle. Behind the engine, remove the right front brake line from the plastic clips securing it. Use a pair of cutting pliers to cut the right front brake line behind the engine. Remove the driver's side section of the right front brake line from the vehicle. Inside of the right front wheel well, use a 10mm wrench to remove the threaded fitting from the right front flex hose. Remove the passenger side section of the right front brake line from the vehicle. At the firewall behind the engine, use a 10mm wrench to remove the top 2 threaded fittings from the factory unions. Remove the front sections of the 2 rear brake lines from the vehicle. Next, underneath the vehicle at the factory union, use a 10mm wrench to remove the 2 bottom threaded fittings. Use a flat blade screwdriver or pair of pliers to remove the brake lines from the plastic clips. At the rear of the charcoal canister, remove the 2 quick connect vent tubes. Disconnect the vent valve electrical connector. Next, remove the rubber hose from the vent tube. Use a 10mm socket to remove the 4 bolts that secure the charcoal canister into position and remove the canister from the vehicle. Use a 19mm socket to remove the 2 rear bolts and loosen the front bolt at the driver's side rear of the front subframe. This will allow you to rotate the brace out of the way to route the brake lines. Use a flat blade screwdriver or pair of pliers to remove the rear brake lines from the plastic clips. Inside of the rear wheel wells, use a 10mm wrench to remove the threaded fittings from both rear flex hoses. At the front of the fuel tank, disconnect the fuel supply quick connect fitting by opening the safety clip and depressing the 2 plastic tabs to disconnect it. Reposition the nylon supply line attached to the fuel tank so it is pointed upwards to minimize any fuel loss. Use a flat blade screwdriver to remove the fuel tank wiring harness from the plastic clip located in front of the fuel tank, along with the 2 front clips on the fuel tank itself. Remove the vent tube from the plastic clip located on the center fuel tank strap and remove the bolt using a 14mm socket. The bolt on the other side of the strap is located above the drive shaft and is difficult to remove. Bend the fuel tank strap so it is pointed towards the other side of the vehicle. Position a support below the center of the fuel tank and use a 14mm socket to remove the 4 remaining bolts that secure the front and rear fuel tank straps and remove the straps from the vehicle. Carefully lower the fuel tank until you have access to the brake lines located above the tank. We are not completely removing the fuel tank, we are only repositioning the tank so that you can reach above it to route the brake lines. Remove the brake lines from the plastic clips above the fuel tank using a flat blade screwdriver or pliers. Use a pair of cutting pliers to cut the right rear brake line in front of the rear subframe. Remove the center section of the right rear brake line from the vehicle. Next, cut the left rear brake line in front of the rear subframe using a pair of cutting pliers. Remove the center section of the left rear brake line from the vehicle. Finally, remove the 2 rear sections of the left rear and right rear brake lines from the vehicle. To begin the installation of your new LinesToGo stainless steel brake lines, start by installing the rear section of the right rear brake line labeled 06D into position. Start the rear threaded fitting into the top of the right rear flex hose by hand. Next, install the next section of the right rear brake line labeled 06C into position, routing it over the parking brake cables. Secure the line into the plastic clips. Connect the two sections of line at the threaded union, noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Install the next section of the right rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 06B into position. Connect the line to the previous line at the threaded union, noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Start the front threaded fitting into the bottom of the passenger side factory union at the firewall. Tighten the front and rear threaded fittings using a 10mm wrench. Tighten the two unions using a 10mm and a 13mm wrench. Next, install the rear section of the left rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 05D into position. Start the rear threaded fitting into the top of the left rear flex hose. Install the next section of the left rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 05C into position. Connect the two lines at the threaded union, noting the LinesToGo color-coded connection. Next, install the next section of the left rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 05B into position. Connect the rear of the line at the union, noting the color-coded connection. Start the front threaded fitting into the bottom of the driver's side factory union. Tighten the front and rear threaded fittings using a 10mm wrench. Tighten the two unions using a 10mm and a 13mm wrench. With the main section of the rear brake lines installed underneath the vehicle, raise the fuel tank back into position. Replace the front and rear fuel tank straps using a 14mm socket. Remove the support from underneath the fuel tank and secure the center fuel tank strap using a 14mm socket and replace the vent tube into the plastic clip. Secure the fuel tank wiring harness back into the plastic clips. Reconnect the nylon supply line at the front of the fuel tank. Replace the charcoal canister back into position and replace the 4 bolts that secure it using a 10mm socket. Reconnect the rubber vent hose at the canister to the fuel vapor line above it. Replace the electrical connector at the vent valve. Replace the 2 remaining vent tubes at the rear of the canister. Reposition the brace at the driver's side rear of the front subframe and secure it using a 19mm socket. Next, install the front section of the left rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 05A into position. Start the front threaded fitting into the top of the ABS module. Start the other fitting into the top of the driver's side factory union. Tighten both fittings using a 10mm wrench. Next, install the front section of the right rear LinesToGo brake line labeled 06A into position. Start the front threaded fitting into the top of the ABS module. Start the other fitting into the top of the passenger side factory union. Tighten both threaded fittings using a 10mm wrench. Next, install the driver's side section of the right front LinesToGo brake line labeled 04A into position. Start the threaded fitting into the top of the ABS module. Install the next section of the right front LinesToGo brake line labeled 04B into position. Start the threaded fitting into the top of the right front flex hose by hand. Connect the two lines behind the engine at the union, noting the color-coded connection. Tighten the union using a 10mm and a 13mm wrench. Tighten the fittings in the ABS module and the right front flex hose using a 10mm wrench. Replace any plastic clips removed earlier. Next, install the left front LinesToGo brake line labeled 03 into position. Start the top fitting into the top of the ABS module by hand. Start the lower fitting into the top of the left front flex hose and tighten both threaded fittings using a 10mm wrench. Replace the metal clip removed earlier and secure it using a 10mm socket. Next, install the primary LinesToGo brake line labeled 01 into position. Start the top threaded fitting into the rear port in the master cylinder and the bottom fitting into the top of the ABS module. Tighten both fittings using a 10mm wrench. Next, install the secondary LinesToGo brake line labeled 02 into position. Start the top threaded fitting into the front port in the master cylinder and the bottom fitting into the side port in the ABS module. Tighten both threaded fittings using a 10mm wrench. Replace any remaining plastic clips removed earlier. Use a 10mm wrench to bleed all four wheels, making sure to keep the master cylinder reservoir topped up with fluid. Replace all four wheels and torque to your manufacturer's recommended specification using a 21mm socket. Replace the intake air tube back into position and tighten the bottom clamp using a 10mm wrench. Replace the rubber hose at the engine and replace the clamp. Reconnect the rubber hose at the vent line by the ABS module. Reconnect the PCV tube to the intake air tube. Replace the lower air filter housing back into position and tighten the 3 bolts using a 10mm socket. Replace the air filter and air filter housing lid back into position. Latch the air filter housing closed using the 2 metal clips at the front of the housing. Connect the intake tube to the air filter lid and tighten the clamp using a 10mm socket. Connect the purge valve and mass airflow electrical connectors and secure the wiring harness using the plastic clips. Reconnect the negative battery terminal and secure it using a 10mm wrench. This concludes the installation of stainless steel brake lines on a 2006 Toyota Rav4 using LinesToGo part number BLT-110-SS. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions or would like to purchase the lines you saw today, please call us at 1-855-781-5992. Email us at info@linestogo.com or check out our website link below. And don't forget to take advantage of our free 2-day shipping. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button below, and we will see you on our next video.